Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about reviewing our change processes. So for those of you who may have seen last month's webinar where I talked about when we want to actually put in new change, this is just a little bit different. So we're going to be talking about reviewing your change performance. And actually, while we're looking at reviewing your change performance, we're going to be just having a look at how we might do that. And if you've got any questions about that, then you can either put them into the comments section wherever you're watching this live, and I'll come back and try and answer them. Or alternatively, you can put them through. It's best to put them through the comments. If you're watching this at a bit later on, you're not actually seeing this live, you're seeing the later recording of it, still please put any questions or queries into the comments section below, because we'll come back and check in on what people might have asked later. So if you're watching this live now, if you wouldn't mind putting into the comments where you're actually watching from, you're working at home or you're in the office today, but where you're actually located, and in particular if there's anything specific that you were hoping that I would be covering today. So when we've kind of put out some of the promotions about what I'll be talking about today, there would have been opportunity for you to let me know if there were specific questions, and if there's anything that you're kind of thinking of on the way through, you can always put them through into the comments. So let's kind of move on and see. We'll start talking about what I'm going to talk to you about today, and as the comments come through, if there's anybody watching live and has some comments, we'll try and address them, and I'll bring them up as we go. All right, so let's just get started, and we'll keep going along the way. I'm just going to start with this presentation that I'm just going to show you looking just at how you review your change performance, because from the beginning of the year I said the focus that we were going to have was about looking at change management, because change is actually the area that causes the biggest risk from a psychological injury perspective. So just if there's anybody who kind of wanted to let me know that they were watching live at the minute and wanted to sort of put their hand up and let me know where you watching from, then we can come back to that. Everybody's being a bit quiet today. I think there's a lot of things kind of going on at the moment. People are a bit distracted about lots of things. Anyway, as I said, change is actually the biggest risk for psychosocial injury, and when we're talking about that in the workplace, it becomes a much bigger problem, and we want to make sure that whenever we put change in place, that we've actually managed the change effectively, so that we're not causing undue or excess stress to the people who are affected by the change. And so if you've been keeping up with a lot of the sort of little videos and things that we've been putting out in the last couple of months, you'll notice that I talk quite generally about the fact that change needs a lot of consideration around communication, around making sure that you've connected with people, that you've got buy-in, that you've explained the detail about why the change needs to happen to those people, and that when you've explained all of those things and made sure people are on board about why the change is necessary, that they're kind of coming with you on the journey to ensure that the change is quite effective. So I think that that's the part that's really quite useful to understand about the little bits and improving our sort of change performance. When we want to review the change performance, we actually have to look at a couple of those different things. And why do I talk about the fact that this is so important? And that's because 92% of serious psychological workplace injury claims are attributed to work-related stress. So that mental stress that comes from, people not being clear about what's expected of them, what their obligations are, all of these things are elements that are really quite important when we start looking at anytime we kind of manage change. And that's actually why change is the most risky kind of point in terms of that psychological injury, because poorly managed change puts people under extreme levels of stress. And so it's how we manage stress along the way of any of the changes that happened in our work environment. And we'll talk along the way about a couple of different things in terms of that review process. But one of the reasons that we need to focus on this, and that's why I keep coming back to it, is because it's such a big risk for psychological injury claims. And that becomes a really big cost to business. And it's because psychological injuries are actually the things that will cost the business the most amount of money, not just in lost time, but also in increased premiums for workers' compensation going forward. And we understand that psychological injuries are actually the things that will keep people out of the workplace for the longest period of time. So I talk a lot about traumatic injury prevention, what we can do to make sure that people stay, and even if they're not doing so well, but they're able to recover at work rather than actually having them exit the work environment. Because if they exit the work environment, it's actually very difficult to try and get people back. So it's the big element of the prevention is about trying to make sure that we have addressed the issues that kind of create psychological injuries before they actually become a claim for an injury, right? So we're trying to kind of do all of these things to make sure that your organization operates in much more effective way, more proactively addressing some of the issues that we know cause people to put in psychological injury claims. So that's why we're talking about change. And actually, sorry, I've got a cough. How does that happen? I think it's always funny when you get a coughing fit in the middle of talking live. All right, bear with me 2 seconds. It's one of those things that you never have, right? Until you're actually talking to people live and then something catches your throat. All right, let's get on with it. So we've talked about the why we're trying to make sure that we prevent the injuries from happening. And now I've gone all croaky on you. The problem is that when people go off on an injury claim, we've got at least 18 weeks off work. I can't believe how I sound now. This is quite funny. And then the average cost of a claim is over $32,000. Now, even though most of you will have insurance and that sort of thing, what that does is actually increases your workers' compensation insurance premiums. And goodness me, they represent 12% of all serious claims. So this is why it is actually a really big problem. And that's why I talk about it so much, because what we want to try and do is make sure that we prevent those injuries from actually happening in the first place. Now, who am I to talk to you about this? For those of you who may have seen me talk about things in webinars before, I was written up as Australia's most influential woman in mental health. I'm sure there are lots of other influential people out there, but I think it's because it's reasonably consistent in terms of trying to help people understand that we can actually prevent psychological injuries. Whereas I think a lot of the psychological community focus on trying to treat the injury once it's actually developed. And I kind of, especially with COVID, one of the things that we noticed is that the dependency on the psychological community to help everybody has actually increased to such an extent that it's 6 months wait to get in to see a psychologist. So we need to be able to be on the front foot about this and not be waiting for psychologists to kind of come along to help with the injury. Once it's actually happened, we want to try and prevent the injury from happening in the first place. All right, I think I've managed to get over my coughing fit, says she, don't speak too soon. All right. When we talk about change and change in any organization, there are four keys that we have that are essential for making sure that we create effective change processes. And I addressed these in more detail last month. We talk about consultation, communication, support, and then review. And what we're talking about today is actually that last component, the review process. Now, in essence, the review process goes back and checks in on the first three elements and how well you actually did those things in order to get to a point where you know that you've kind of one implemented the change effectively and in the best way possible. But the whole point of the review is about making sure that people get an opportunity to let you know what worked well, what didn't work well, and what might need to be done differently if you did another change process in the future. And I think this is the bit that's actually really quite important in the sense of being able to know that we can, when we talk about a post transition review, and I'm just going to I was just going to try because the slides actually. The question is, how do we solve the problem? Did we solve the problem? So the whole point of doing a post-transition review is purely and simply to have a look at, did we resolve the problem or not? And if we resolve the problem, then not only have we got an effective outcome that's given us some benefit, because one of the reasons that we do change in the first place is because we think that we need to improve something to get a better outcome. The whole point of understanding change and not making people feel like we just do change for change's sake is actually to make sure that we do a post transition review. And the first question that we always need to ask is, did we solve the problem that we were hoping to solve? So if anybody's got any kind of questions or comments along the way, please make sure that you just put them into the comments section and I'll address them as we go. But this is the most important bit that we need to ask ourselves and answer the question. Now, part of that review process is actually about having a look at that consultation. So if we resolve the problem, that's fantastic. If the outcome that we actually had from the change process, whether it was a big or a small change process, doesn't matter. If we actually achieved at the end of the day what it was that we aimed for, then that's the fantastic bit that then we can say, yep, we've ticked that box and worked really well. We need to have a look at how we undertook consultation, because we may have achieved the outcome, but did we do it in the most efficient or effective way? So the collaborative review process is then about checking in with people about and this can be a simple survey, right? Did you feel that we consulted you enough? Did you feel that the way that different consultation processes were undertaken, gave you an opportunity to provide, detailed input, effective kind of, you felt heard in the process? Because a big part of, depending on the size of the change program that you're trying to put in place, the consultation is actually key to whether or not you're going to address the change in the best possible way. So that collaborative review process is essential for understanding whether or not, we want to make sure that we've asked people, we've got their input. When we're done, we kind of go, do you feel that we gave you enough opportunity for input through that consultation process? If not, what else could we have done better? So one of the biggest problems that I see in organizations is that the change, if they can tick the box that says, yes, the change did what we were hoping for it to do, they kind of stop there and they don't review anything else that they did. They just kind of want to, pat themselves on the back and go, yay, we got that change through and it worked. But we want to actually have a look at some of these things where we go, you know what, did we consult enough? And that collaborative review process, asking people whether or not they felt that we gave them enough opportunity to. The thing with any review process is that what we're actually reviewing is the process, okay, not the people involved, not the effectiveness of the project manager or the person who actually put that project into place. It's the element of the process itself is the thing that we're trying to review. When we're looking at the collaboration elements, did we give people enough opportunity to input? If not, why not? What do we learn to move it forward so that then we improve the process and the documentation around the process so that we capture the improvements to that process moving forward, so that we get, when we've got the awareness, because we get awareness from just going through something and recognizing, oh, this was good or that wasn't good, this worked, that didn't work. So it's a good opportunity to have a look at that. So looking at the communication bits, it's really important to be able to kind of go, everybody has a different perspective in the communication. When you actually collaborated, when you asked for people's input, when you gave them information about what the project was doing, when you were letting them, keeping them up to date about what was happening, was the communication process effective enough? Did you capture the different communication elements that was enabled people to have their different perspectives, have them heard, but the communication process around, how they were heard and what they interpreted and how they felt about that needs to be captured. Did they feel that, they did have a different perspective and it was completely, nobody listened to it? I mean, these are all things and they're questions that we tend not to check in with people. But if we want to improve our change management processes, we actually need to make sure that we capture these lessons learned. It's one of the things that we do a lot in project management, but we don't tend to actually make it work when we do any other kind of process change, unless it's kind of marked as some sort of special project. So it's just a useful thing to have a look at. And then, have we gone and documented the outcomes or the improvements that we've made? And if, when we do these kind of lessons learned things, we go through and we, with that lessons learned point, we've captured and updated all of our documentation to reflect the change. So this is actually one of the things that I notice a lot, that when people actually will go through a change process and they might make some sort of change process that improves a human resource policy or procedure, they don't tend to go and then mark what, what they've changed or improved and update their policies or update their, procedure manual to reflect what those new changes are. So I think that that's the bit that's actually really quite important, is to make sure that when we've reviewed or we've made any change process happen, that we've been able to then go through and work out what documentation needed to be updated to reflect that new change. And that when we've, reflected the new change, that we've been able to make sure that the documentation has, reflected it. And especially that the documentation is then available to everybody that, is affected by the change. So HR changes are one of the things that documentation often gets a bit lost, and people don't tend to actually make the updates to the documentation later on. And so then you'll have new staff or new people will come in and they're looking at, outdated documentation, or they get frustrated because something's changed and, they haven't been able to see that or read it in that documentation. So really important as well. The next thing is, when you've undertaken a change process, it's actually about asking ask your people for feedback. We often expect that if people are unhappy about something, that they'll just let us know, but we don't actually structure in a facilitated opportunity for them to give us feedback. That, we might send out a survey, but we don't kind of, follow up on the survey or ask, if people haven't filled it in or why they haven't filled it in, or, if you notice that you're not getting a great deal of response or uptake from something, we actually have to kind of make the effort to, be on the front foot about capturing the information, that what worked well, what didn't work well, what are the things that didn't sort of, people didn't really find interesting or engaging. What were the things that people felt, were overdone? I mean, maybe they felt that the communication was just like overkill. maybe you were sending out emails every, second day, and they kind of go, we just needed an update once a week. It didn't really affect us that much. These are all really useful things to capture, because as you do any change process, they'll change depending on, which staff you've got around at the time, and also the size of the organization and the number of people that are affected by the change. But if we can kind of give people an opportunity for feedback, it also allows them to feel like they have a way to kind of, be honest and open about what they thought was great, what didn't work, and just remembering it's an assessment of the process. It's not an assessment of the leader who decided that the process needed to happen. It's an assessment of whether or not it was done effectively. The sense of, communication, the awareness that these people felt that they knew what was happening and why, and that they felt that they were given a lot of opportunity to have input into it. And, if that worked, great. If it didn't work, why not? And we have to actually expressly ask for it, not just assume that people will just give it to us if they're happy, and not if they're not happy, right? So one of the first questions we really do need to ask is, did you actually have buy-in? Did people actually come on board? Was it an easy change process that you were able to put in place? Or did you find that it felt like you had to drag people kicking and screaming to actually help you implement some change? Now, part of what happens, we get this negative feedback where, the staff are kind of like, this person didn't consult with us. And so then it starts on this negative kind of, they're unreasonable, they were being mean about it, they weren't listening to me when I was trying to tell them that wouldn't work, that was abrupt, they were rude, they were, a lot of the things about why you don't get buy-in with people have an awful lot to do with whether or not they feel heard. And so if you felt that you got buy-in and everything went really well, that's fantastic. If you didn't get buy-in, it's an opportunity to kind of go back and have a look and go, well, maybe if we didn't do consultation very well, if we didn't do communication very well, all of those things will explain why you didn't actually get any buy-in, or you didn't get the buy-in that you needed to make it as successful or in the time frame that you needed it to be. So I think that that's an important one to have a look at as well. All right. Stress management, right? And this is one of the things that I talk about a lot, because stress management is really a big thing, in the sense that, if we don't manage stress, if we don't help people to manage their stress, then we find that, we get all sorts of secondary issues. We get higher levels of absenteeism. We get lots of presenteeism, where people are sort of, they're turning up at work supposedly, but they're not really being very effective or making a great contribution with the time. So to manage stress, we actually need a plan. And a lot of that planning, and that's where we talk about change management, we know change is going to induce stress. So when we kind of on the front foot about that, we say to people, okay, well, we know that this is going to produce stress. What are the sorts of things that we can do to help you manage that stress along the way? Then, when we get to the end of it, it's an opportunity for us to kind of go, okay, so how did you feel through the process? Did you feel stressed by the change, or did you feel that, we'd managed that stress effectively? And if we've managed it effectively, that's fantastic. But, what are the things that worked well, what didn't? So it's in essence, it's the same thing that I talk about in other areas. It's just taking the time to have a look at, what worked well, what didn't work well. And that if we ask the question and we give people an opportunity to have some input, they feel validated and heard, and they don't feel like the change just happened for change's sake. So if there's anybody's got any kind of comments or queries about this along the way, please just make sure you put them into the comments section, and I'll address them as we go. But even if you think all this is just making great sense to you, throw in a comment about, how that makes a lot of sense. What happens with review processes is that most of the time people kind of get to the end and they're so excited that they've finished that they just kind of go, cool, that's done. What's next? And you really do need to give yourself that little bit of time to go and check in with people about, how they felt about the change. Do they feel it did what it needed to do? Did they feel supported through the process? What could you have done better? Because it's just, even just that, giving them the opportunity to have some input then makes them feel like that the process is something that we're kind of also learning from, that we're trying to give some people insight, that we're trying to make things different, we're trying to improve them, that this is important and it's valuable and it's needed. And, so their perspective on it is also something that's important to capture. So this is the bit that I think is really, an essential part of checking in with people. Did you get the support that you needed? And if not, why not? And what can we do to make it better into the future? You will always get a lot more sort of, buy-in moving forward to the next change process if you've asked people if they got what they needed from the previous one, and they can see that what they're getting is some sort of, opportunity to understand, not only how the process worked, but the fact that the change was not just for the sake of change, that actually along the way we looked at what we did well, we tried to plan for it, we tried to then go back and review it, and people then go, oh, so they do want to know what happened. I am important enough to ask for some feedback, and then you tend to get the information which you don't tend to get otherwise, because people don't tell you unless you ask. It's the same in reverse. We often get upset about not getting things because we have expectations that people should know, or they should just react in a particular way, instead of, we don't actually ask them for their input. So I always say to people, if you're upset about something, if you're upset that, even you as the leader, if you put the change in and it improves stuff, and you're upset that the staff haven't come to you and said, oh, thanks a lot, that really made a big difference to my work, you have to actually look and go, did you ask them? Did you ask them if, what they felt about the change, and if they'd noticed that it improved things? Because we just have this tendency to kind of go, people should see what I've done and see how it's improved things, and they should let me know. But we never ever ask for what we want. And what we want is feedback. What we want is some input. And it's the same as why when I'm talking about doing this process and why it's important, because people want to feel that when they've given you some information about what they think about something, that they feel that they've been heard and considered, and that what they've said is important. By going back to them and asking them, how did this go? Did we do it well? Did it meet your expectations? They then don't feel like all of that effort of giving you some input was for, no reason, because they can hear that you've taken into consideration what they said. You may not necessarily have done what they wanted you to do, what they thought needed to be done, but they at least felt that they've been heard and they've been considered, and that they've then got an opportunity to provide that feedback, so that if another change that's similar or in a similar area comes along in the future, which no doubt it will, then we've at least let them know on the front foot that we do anticipate these sorts of things having some, really kind of positive improvement changes moving forward, right? So it's not change for change's sake. It's not, oh, here we go again, same thing. And they don't, feel that they've been engaged in all of it, because essentially what we're talking about is people, and people come with all of their own funny little quirkiness, but they'll be more engaged if they feel that that the engagement and the input that they provide is important to you, right? So it's part of, I'm writing a new book this year, and one of the things I'm doing is actually interviewing leaders about some of the things that they do in their organizations, and how they've, potentially improved engagement, or, the processes around things that they've tried to improve to help with their psychosocial injuries, or, just what they've noticed to try and improve their culture, the things that have they've actively kind of gone out of their way to make people feel valued and important by changing the way that they do things. And there's some really innovative stuff out there that people have done, that I think, the old kind of ideas of that command and control stuff is giving way to a whole bunch of much more sort of flatter structure, open collaboration, and shared kind of responsibilities around problems and improvements. And that really does make a big difference, and it does change the way people will engage in any kind of organizational process. So it's actually really quite important. All right, so we're getting through this one a bit quicker this time because everybody's been being quiet. I think you're all kind of busy eating lunch and not really making comments, but that's all right. The reason that we focus on ensuring that our change management processes are, really carefully considered and make sure that they're done in a really clear and consistent way, and that we're reviewing them, is because if we don't, and we end up with injured workers because they're highly stressed and they don't feel they have a voice or input into the organizational, change, improvement, moving things forward, we end up with psychological injury claims. And when we start looking at the cost of business of mental health, and this is where we've looked at COVID and we've got some of these issues that happen, if we start looking at, depression, for example, it costs business in this country $6.3 billion a year, right? So that's a lot. We end up, if we get depressed people, we've got 154% loss in performance. We get 12% higher absenteeism, and that's what these are all the things that attribute to that 6.3 billion. It costs the business nearly $5,000 in low engagement, right? Because this person is not engaged in the work environment. So being aware of people's mental health kind of challenges and the things that are impacting them that might come from outside is important, but making sure that the business itself is not adding or contributing to that in any way, or in fact, in some cases, as it does, causing the problem, then we kind of want to be much more proactive and on the front foot about helping our people manage their mental health, because it's as much a part of them as their physical health, and about whether or not they're going to turn up every day. Now, interestingly, there has been an increase in workers' compensation claims around mental health of 34% since COVID. So in the last 2 years, there's been a much higher incident of COVID-related mental health workers' compensation claims. Now, that's a huge jump, right? It also gives a clear indication of how people in the community are being affected by the changes, the implications of everything that's happened with COVID around controlling our environment and the things that we, can and cannot do, and the pressure that that's put on us as human beings, and how that's then playing out in the work environment. So it's a really important thing to recognize. I just want to take you back to that thing. I'll take my face off there for a second. That information actually came from the Australian Workplace Barometer Project. So something that's worthwhile having a look at if you want any more information. So if you would like to share with me one thing that was helpful from today's presentation, it would be really good if you want to put that into the comments. I'm thinking that there's, quite a bit of stuff that's useful for people to have a look at. One of the comments that, yep, so thank you. It's actually the noticeable idea that the review process is just as important as the planning process. And I think that that's a really important point to make, that it's one of the things that we kind of so focused on getting it in and making the bottom line, whatever that change was meant to improve, it was financial. We're so focused on, patting ourselves on the back for that we forget to go back and actually have a look at, did we do a good job about the process itself? And I think that that's always a really important thing to do. So thank you for that comment. All right. So what do we need to do if we stop and have a look at if we've got higher levels of mental health just generally in the population as a result of COVID? Well, what does that mean for our work environment? We have higher levels of mental health sort of challenges that are showing up at work, or there's a bit more of a crossover. We talk about work-life balance. A lot of people used to say years ago, oh, keep your private life at home. It doesn't happen the same way anymore. And in reality, it can't really. We can't just sort of tell people to switch off, especially if they've got an unwell family member or something else, that's going on at home. Of course, that's going to come into the work environment. So I do a lot of training with organizations around, improving the mental health literacy of managers. So if you've got any of your staff who are in that middle management layer that probably, just need some better insight or understanding about general mental health. We talk about mental health first aid, but mental health first aid is almost looking at the things that you're looking for, the kind of warning signals in your people. It's not really about necessarily improving the literacy of the manager themselves to understand some of the things that are going on and how to deal with them. And that's one of the things that we know, that if we can improve mental health literacy within the management team, that we do get better outcomes as far as those staff go, and they feel more supported. So the new workshop that we've just put together about reviewing your change performance. So it's a more practical kind of unpacking of the things that I've kind of covered off at a really high level today, but it's more about, looking at the actual steps that we might take to identify the effectiveness of the consultation, looking at the shortcomings of the communication and what we can improve, the documentation and application consistency. It's one of the things that we hear a lot, is that the documentation might exist, but depending on the policies or how, at what level sign off for certain things happen, we can find that the application is not consistent across an organization. So there's a couple of those things that we try and have a look at too. The clarity of the support that the staff felt that they got throughout the change process, and then looking at, how we effectively assess and provide constructive feedback on an ongoing basis. So if that's something that you might be interested in, or any of our other workplace training, you might like to have a look at that kerryhoward.com.au just /workplace, and you'll see there are a couple of the different sort of workshops that we can run. If there's something specific for your organisation that you would like some support with, just reach out and let us know. I will give you some details about where you can do that shortly. All right. Then having a look at building resilience within teams, there is a 12-week program that I run that's called Mental Muscle for Teams. So the Mental Muscle Method. It's actually about how we build resilience. And it is much more of a resilience building project. It's actually done over that sort of extended period, because you need that, in much the same way as when you go into any kind of exercise program for yourself. You don't just go to the gym one day and do one workout and think that that's going to be enough to keep you going for keep you fit for the rest of your life. You go into a gym program, you recognize that you have to do quite a bit to build your body up to a certain level, and then you need to maintain it. So it's one of those things that we don't tend to just sign up and say we'll go to the gym once and then we're all good, which is what tends to happen with mental health training. We kind of go to mental health first aid and go, yay, if I've done mental health first aid, then I'm good. I understand everything for the rest of my life. No, you don't. And I think that's a big part of understanding about, building up on our repertoire or our skill set in this area. And I think that's a really important point to make. All right, then looking at how we improve resilience in our people in general. When we have resilient staff members, we find that we've got enhanced focus, that they've got better mental strength, that they've got increased endurance to some of the things that do cause stress in the work environment like in an ongoing basis. If you work in an environment that's a very reactive environment, then, it just is by its nature a bit more of a stressful environment. And then we find that there's a lot that really does improve flexibility in terms of people's ability to kind of adapt and make adjustments on the fly really quite quickly. So that's an important thing to understand about why we're trying to build resilience in our people. So if any of you have not seen this before, this is actually our psych injury prevention assessment. So you can go to this address and actually assess your organisation's psychological injury risk. Important if you do that, that you've got a little bit of an understanding about what's actually happened in the HR area in your organisation in the past. So if that's not you, but there is somebody else in the HR area that would be able to give you some of the information that you might require, you'll understand what I mean. It's not a long questionnaire by any means. It's sort of only 25 questions. Takes less than 5 minutes, but it does ask what's gone on in your organisation in terms of, at a high level, have there been lots of psychological injury claims for the percentage of people, that sort of stuff. So it's not a big thing, but it is a couple of key questions. And that's where we notice a lot of people start it and then they kind of go, oh, I don't know the answer to that question. So they just, stop there. The other thing I'll say to you is if you don't really know, just take a guess. It's not really going to make any difference in terms of, varying your score that greatly, but it gives you some sort of indicator of some of the other areas whether the organisation works well or doesn't. And then because it gives you these scorecard results that cover off on these 5 different areas. Now, those 5 different areas are actually aligned with a report that was produced by Black Dog at the end of last year. It was October, called Modern Work: How changes to the way that we work are impacting Australians' mental health. And in that, they made 5 recommendations for business. And what was good about that was that we were already addressing those 5. And that's one of the things that we do in the organisational assessment. So when we look at what they've said the 5 areas are and what's in brackets are the areas within the scorecard that we look at. One is training your leaders. So that's about how we manage our people. Empowering people is about looking at your HR policies and procedures and making sure that there's clarity and consistency. Intervening early, which is about the prevention elements, about what do we do when we know that we've got people in a particular situation and the stress is kind of increasing. How do we intervene early so that we can prevent the injury from occurring? Then they talk about prevention. What they talk about as prevention is what I'm talking to you about today. It's actually about prevention in the common areas that we know cause problems, like change management. So one of the biggest risk indicators is around change, and it's because it's usually poorly managed. So where they talk about prevention, they're specifically talking about using things like change management to do it better so that we prevent the injury. And then they talk about transition, which is what we talk about as your agility. So it's how adaptable are you? How flexible are you to be able to change things, reasonably quickly? And I think a lot of organizations over the last couple of years since COVID have got much better at being able to adapt and a bit more agile. So my challenge to you is actually, how do you create a psychologically healthy workplace in 2022? And if, you can do that, what does it look like? If you, think that you're already on the path, that's fantastic. What are the things that you've done that have worked really well? And actually, if there's anybody who thinks that that they've done a really good opportunity, then I'm going to give you that opportunity to be interviewed for my new book. So if you believe that your organization has actually done something that was really spectacular and amazing and has had a really kind of positive impact on your people, then I'd like you to reach out to me and let me know so that I can look at who is the senior person in your organization that might be able to interview for the book and get a spotlight shining on that really positive thing. So I think that would be fantastic if there are people out there that think we can do that. I want you to just try and remember that pre-COVID, we used to talk about 1 in 5 Australians would put their hand up and say they had a mental health injury or issue, report some level of psychological distress. Post-COVID, we've now got 4 in 5 people talking about psychological distress. And that's a really important point. And one of the reasons that I talk so much about prevention, because we know that there are these other things that are causing issues. And we want to make sure that we've been able to, address those issues by recognizing that people are already feeling sort of pressured and stressed. And that if we don't address some of those things, we've got a much bigger threat looming about, the approach kind of being taken as coming from the workplace on that stress, without people really recognizing then, when they're not coping themselves with regards to some of the other challenges just in work in general. All right, so it could be you, it could be the boss, could be other stakeholders, could be anybody really. And so I think that's an important number to keep in mind as we do these things. All right, the new book I mentioned earlier is coming in 2022. I'm actually interviewing and writing that book, interviewing for it and writing it right now. So it will be out later in the year. You'll know when there's a definite launch date for sure. But yeah, looking at the trouble with trauma in organizations or in business, and looking at how we prevent workplace injuries in a post-COVID world, because I think it's really important, something to talk about. All right. And I can't see any specific questions in the comments. If there's anything as you're watching this later on that you've got any questions about, please feel free to put them in the comments below, and we can come back to them. If there's anything else that you want to kind of know from me, you can get more information at the website, kerryhoward.com.au. And I'm, hoping that we'll be able to help you out on any of those sort of questions or queries that you might have, or that your organization needs some support with. All right, but if there's no other last comments or questions, I think we've hit our time anyway. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I really do hope that you got some benefit out of that. And I look forward to seeing you soon.